This channel is supported by Truefire. Truefire is an online library
enough, you can get the Truefire All Access Pass for as cheap as they ever do it, the $99 thing. So just jump and do that if you're looking for the best price you can get Truefire All Access for.
Okay, this is something that I think about quite a lot as a guitarist who's out there, you know, gigging, doing all sorts of stuff, you know, playing dodgy function gigs, playing dodgy pub gigs, lots of dodgy stuff. But you occasionally will encounter a scenario where someone wants you to turn your amp down, which I've definitely been told before, or even turn your FRFR down. I'm someone who doesn't try to be like the loudest guitarist, because I'm sort of quite sensitive to that idea that over the years, you know, a lot of us have been very loud. The one scenario I think that I am a little bit more loud is if it's a 2-guitar gig, because it's one of those things where you kind of, for instance, if you're taking a solo, you want to definitely be heard over the other guitar rig. So in that case, it gets a bit problematic. But I found a really good article, because I think this is like a bit of a contentious issue, and it's kind of, I think, indicative of how things have changed a little bit. But Huw Price, you know, Edalesco's bud, they've got a YouTube channel, and Huw obviously, you know, does some really important stuff in terms of the vintage guitar world. Yeah, check out the article on Guitar World, Guitarist. Yeah, the way it kind of starts the article, any guitarist who has played live is pretty much guaranteed to have been asked to turn down by the front of house sound engineer, with the inevitable tonal compromises that ensued. So that is one of the things for me which is a little bit, can be problematic, because, you know, we have this idea that as you turn up your tube amp is where the magic starts to happen. This is definitely something with that pedal show where you see that we're using like a Deluxe Reverb and stuff like that, and they talk about like on your amp there's like a spot where things start to happen and get a bit different. Now, honestly, as someone out there gigging a Deluxe Reverb, beyond 2 or 3 on that volume, I think is getting to the stage where actually if you do that on a gig, you're a loud guitarist. We're not just talking about Marshalls on 10. I think Fender amps on 2 or 3, you know, particularly if it's a Pro Reverb on 2 or 3, that's going to be loud. If it's a Twin or 2 or 3, really loud. I think what we should probably be using as a reference is like, how loud is the drummer, maybe? Equally, most sound engineers have felt obliged to ask guitarists to turn down at one time or another because they can't deal with volume. As well as being a guitarist, I worked for many years as a live sound guy in venues all over Europe, so I can relate to both sides of the argument. That said, I made a point of principle never to ask a guitarist to turn down, which is interesting. The volume wars drag on, but a little mutual understanding and knowing some simple tricks might smooth the path to peace and great sounds, both on and off stage. So this is what Huw has got in terms of wisdom. All understand that guitar amps need to be turned up to reach the sweet spot where valves and speakers combine to optimize tone and playability. When sound engineers tell us we have to turn down, we know that our tone will suffer, our rig will be harder to play, and we probably won't enjoy performing as much as we should. Now, for me, the main issue here is that tone and volume are actually very much tied. Like, if you can't hear your guitar tone very well, I don't think it's necessary that amps come alive magically at any sort of volume. You know, you get more breakup or more compression, all that sort of stuff. But the other thing that happens is, even if you just try turning like a vocal down or up relative to other things, the way that we perceive those things totally changes depending on volume, right? So even if even if it might not be true that you have to totally crank a Deluxe Reverb to get a great tone, what you do have to hear it to think you've got a great tone. Engineers often insist they need complete control, and that means being able to balance every component of the band. If you're playing in an arena or an outdoor festival, that's fair enough, but we're not discussing that here. In smaller venues with musicians and punters crammed into enclosed spaces, it doesn't actually make sense because some elements, such as drums and guitars, are often sufficiently loud not to require additional amplification. In addition to being integral to the sound guitarists produce, our amps serve as individual PA systems and onstage monitors that allow us to hear ourselves and the audience to hear us too. So long as the amp isn't excessively loud, there is surely no point in compromising our tones to simply hand more control to an engineer who may be completely unfamiliar with the sound of your band. Worse still, the engineer will most likely place a fairly low quality moving coil dynamic microphone on your speaker and add mixing desk equalization in a futile attempt to compensate sonic qualities lost by forcing you to turn down. I think that probably the EQ is actually probably been used to chop out even more of your tone so that we can hear vocal or keyboard or whatever. At the end of this process, the guitar signal will end up going through a speaker system that has been optimized for vocals or drums rather than guitars. It will probably feel somewhat disconnected because you will be hearing more of your guitar sound from the PA speakers than you can on stage. Inevitably, you will need to have some guitar routed to the nearest monitor wedge, but it will probably sound rubbish, and if your vocals are also coming through the monitors, they'll be harder to hear. In essence, you're forced to be quieter so that someone else can make you louder, sound worse, and struggle to hear yourself on stage. It's not ideal. My preference, whether I'm in the audience or operating the mixing desk, is to feel like I'm listening to the band rather than the PA system. Now, that's a real crucial thing because I think that is something where other sound guys totally differ. But, for instance, when I'm doing sound and my buddy Lewis Corbett, we were doing it the other day, the idea for us has more or less been like, let's try and get it so it's not feeding back and so that it sounds like we can hear the individual elements. Like, does it sound like a band? Not necessarily does it sound like super polished, like a CD. Like, that doesn't work when you've got a live drummer. It just doesn't. Anyway, anytime I've attended a gig or a concert in a smallish venue where the sound is excellent, it's almost as if the PA system isn't there. So that's a really, really cool thing to aim for, I think, like that more natural sound. One professional term that I like is sound reinforcement because it describes how sound systems in small to medium-sized venues can function really well. Now, unlike string quartets or acoustic folk ensembles, guitar bands are inherently imbalanced. A primary function of the front of house system is to rectify that. So balancing those quieter elements with the natural acoustic of the louder ones. The vocals will be dependent on the PA system, but electric guitar, for example, might not even need to go through front of house, if there's an amp, that is. In a medium-sized venue, a little bit of guitar may need to go through the PA for reinforcement or an occasional lift for solos. But it's fine if 80% or more of the guitar sound that the audience hears comes straight off the stage. The same applies to drums for reasons that should be obvious. Now, definitely, I differ with Huw here. I've never heard any sound engineer ask a drummer to turn down the snare. I have. I've asked drummers to play slightly more quietly, or when there's a sound limiter. It just is not possible for a drummer to be playing at full clip in some venues, and also not really appropriate. In small or medium-sized venues, there's probably no need to mic overheads or hi-hats. Toms usually need a little help, and it's fine to reinforce kick and snare drums. Now, again, for me, like the venues that we tend to play, like these big sort of barn type things, generally the snare is going to be loud enough. The cymbals are for sure going to be loud enough. Reinforcing the kick for sure to get things moving along kind of helps. The common misconception that drums have to be louder in the PA than they are acoustically causes many problems. When drums are over-amplified, it becomes harder to get the vocals loud enough. Those turned-down guitar amps will be inaudible unless they also go through the PA. And the resulting mix often ends up being something to endure rather than enjoy. It goes on to talk about like modern venues with multiple mixer channels and lots of mics, and about how that's shifting the power away from the band and to the sound engineer, so you're really ending up working to what the sound engineer wants, which I think is kind of where we are in 2025 a lot of the time. The life of front of house engineers is not an easy one. They work antisocial hours and usually overstressed and underpaid like musicians. Taking control of their environment is a typical coping strategy for stressed people, and one way engineers attempt to do this is by limiting on-stage volume levels. One way to be helpful and professional is to provide a sheet of paper with the band's name lineup and the positions they prefer. Tell the engineer which members sing and who will need DI boxes. Give them a sound check that gives a fair representation of the band. Be willing to take instructions from the sound engineer, start and stop playing when you're told, and give them time to work on it. If you need more vocals in your wedge, don't hassle the engineer when they're busy working on the drums or bass. Pick your moments. I try to do that, especially like when it comes to talk about in-ear mixes. It's like, right, there is a time to do that, and it's once everything else is kind of done. Unfortunately, with in-ear stuff, it does always seem like it's like the last priority. And for you as the musicians, it's kind of tricky because it's like, well, actually, it's really hard to enjoy a gig sometimes when the in-ear stuff is so dodgy. Guitarists should consider how their rig is going to work at any given venue. For instance, if you rock up to a pub gig with a 100-watt amp and expect to run it loud, you'll be asked to turn down. If you bring a more appropriate 10-watt or 15-watt amp and the engineer asks you to turn that down, you might be justified in being worried about the professional competence. On-stage balance, so if you have two guitarists, have one on the left and one on the right. Bigger on-stage sound, that's really important, I guess. Set the amp levels so they balance with the rhythm section that everybody can hear what they need to hear. If necessary, put amps up on chairs or beer crates so they're not firing towards your ankles and the bass won't sound too boomy. Try towing them in slightly so they fire across the stage as well as forward. This will help your bandmates hear what you're playing, as well, I guess, getting people out of being like right in the firing line of it. Before you put any instruments into monitor wedges, make sure the vocals can be heard. If you can achieve a good on-stage balance, you can keep what's going in the monitor wedges to a minimum. Ideally, all you'll need is a bit of kick and snare in addition to the vocals. And remember the golden rule of mixing: if you can't hear something, that doesn't mean it's too quiet. It's more likely that something else is too loud. And that's an important one for me. Like, if you're thinking, when I go to take my solo, I don't think I'm cutting above stuff. It might not just be that you need more boost on your solo. It might be that maybe the other guitarist that you're playing with should maybe lay back a little bit. And this is something to think about as well. Like, if a keyboard is going to take a solo and I'm in a band, I don't hammer like the chords and stuff. I kind of just try and just play like a slightly more padding thing or single note, something that actually gets out of the way a little bit. And in that way, it means that hopefully the keyboard player doesn't get completely drowned out. Or if I'm playing with another guitarist, what is happening then is that hopefully when they go to take their solo and I've backed off a bit, that the audience is just going to be focusing purely on what they're going to hear from that guitar player, and it not be a situation where like that guitarist is getting frustrated because they feel like they're not being heard because you're being too loud, like as a rhythm player. And I think all of that is really important stuff. It's missing out some of the in-ear elements, which I think additionally complicate things because, you know, in 2025 there is definitely this push that, you know, function bands, professional bands are moving towards in-ears, which in some ways are so much better for hearing stuff and for things not having to be as loud on stage, but actual on-stage vibe is kind of thrown way off because, like, essentially, unless you've got amps as well as this, so an amps situation with in-ears can kind of work quite nicely, but if it's just a situation where it's just drums and then bass and guitar are on direct to front of house situation, on stage can be really weird because like you might just have like a bass trap behind you from the sub, so it's like a woofy kind of sound behind. Your ears will probably be okay, but it's not the most vibey thing. But equally, if you're playing on stage where it's super loud and everyone's got their amps cranked, that's not enjoyable either. So I definitely think it is about like this sort of compromise thing where hopefully our sound people are not going to expect us to have absolutely no stage volume. And as someone who does sound for the band, I actually way prefer mixing when there's a real amp as well, because it's like I don't have to worry about putting that through the front of house. So I definitely agree with that, but that's a situation where I have control. And conversely, if I'm working with another sound guy who's like, you know, one of the things they stress about is definitely like, all I can hear is guitar, or like the guitar's too loud, or I turn it down completely on the mixer and I can still hear it. I think that's kind of what You don't want to be in that situation where they pinpointed you as a problem and then they turn you off at the front of house. That to me is one of those things that's tricky. I've not found a solution for it particularly, and one of the things I think is really important is having a substantial boost so that your solo is brought up to like the level of vocal. But if you show us, you know, it's tricky as well, because some sound guys are going to want to boost you for the solo themselves, but inevitably they will miss those as well. It's a whole tricky thing. So I tend to have my solo level boosted quite high so that I don't have that issue, because I'm assuming that most of the time my other stuff is going to be like below that sort of threshold where it's going to be above the vocal, and so that then when I take a solo, like it's up to where that vocal level roughly was. But it is a whole tricky thing. And then sometimes if like you're working like the other day with Lewis, where he's like got my levels up considerably higher, it's then the solo boost is too much. So there's a lot to think about with this stuff, and I think it's about experimenting, and whatever rig you're using, being able to say, right, well, that boost is actually too much for this situation now, so I need to come in here and take those, you know, levels down a bit. Or, you know, in this situation where I'm playing with another guitarist, actually I do need that full, I don't know, 6 dB boost to get myself heard. Yeah, it's complicated. Articles like this, I think, are really helpful for getting some sense of what it is that a sound guy is looking for, what it is that you as a musician are looking for, and what the band are looking for, and trying to not be super like selfish about it, but equally hold some ground when it is important to. Let me know your thoughts in the comments.